Hello and welcome back to Samvaad, a KIIPS monthly podcast. I am Anindita, Assistant Director Public Relations of KIIPS. KIIPS, or Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, focuses on being a digital and virtual center of knowledge. It intends to provide a platform for conceptualization, investigation, discussion, analysis, and study of the multifarious developments regarding the issues, challenges, diplomacy, security, and connectivity in the Indo Pacific region. This podcast is yet another effort to achieve the same, featuring former diplomats, military officers, and senior academics with an all rounded knowledge of this field. In this episode, we are here to learn about Canadian perspectives on Indo Pacific issues, exclusively with Professor Stephen R. Nagy. So, I request the Director of KIIPS, Dr. Monish Tarangam, to introduce the guest.
Thank you, Anandita, so much. And a warm welcome to a great friend of KIPS, Professor Stephen R. Nagy. For the benefit of our audience, Professor Stephen R. Nagy is a professor of politics and international studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo. He is a senior fellow at MacDonald Laurier Institute, a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. He's the Director of Policy Studies at the Yokosuka Council of Asia Pacific Studies, YCAPS, an Associated Research Fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP, Sweden, and a 2018 AIF Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It is an honor indeed and a pleasure to have you with us to discuss on this very timely topic and a timely theme in the emerging contours of India-Canada relations and also Canada's place in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Stephen, and happy to have you here. Now I request our founder and honorary chairperson, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, to kindly take over the proceedings. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Monish. It is indeed an honor to have Professor Nagy with us, and I know him for so many years. A very talented, brilliant professor and very deep knowledge on what's going on in the Indo-Pacific region. He's right now based in Japan and he's watching the developments in the Indo-Pacific, a region which has about 60% of the global population, about 65% of the global GDP, and half of the global trade passes through this region. So we thought that we'll request him to converse with us and tell us something about the Canadian perspective on the Indo-Pacific, which is very, very important because Canada is an extremely important member, a developed country in the Northern Pacific. So without taking any more time, I would request Nagy to answer my questions. I'll be like your student. I'll just raise some questions and please tell us, to begin with, what exactly are the fundamental interests of Canada in the Indo-Pacific region, Professor?
So thank you very much, Professor Mahapatra. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to you. I think basically Canada's interest in the Indo-Pacific is the same as Japan, the same as India, is that we really are focused on supporting an international order based on rule of law, and that we want to be part of the rules-making process. We want to make sure that the rules that exist are for small, medium, and large-sized countries. We want to lock ourselves into the region, meaning that we're locked in to get the benefits of the region, but also we're locked in to help with the problem solving that's going to be in the region. And here I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about rising sea levels. I'm thinking about trade and the rules of the road for trade. Without being at the table, we're on the menu. So I think, again, Canada has a deep-seated interest in the stability and peace of the region and being part of the rules-making process. And here, this is what I think it shares deeply with India, Japan, Australia, the United States, and other like-minded countries. You're muted, so I can't hear you, Professor.
Until about a few years ago, nobody talked about Indo-Pacific. It was not part of the lexicon of the international relations, but now it is increasingly becoming important, and most of the major powers have come up with their own strategy report as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. So can you briefly tell us what is the Canadian strategy in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think Canada is still working out some of the nuances of its Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, but primarily it's focused on ASEAN centrality, So a strong engagement with the Southeast Asian countries. It's focused on really, again, this idea of an international order based on rule of law. So it's supporting maritime claims of claimants within the region. It wants to ensure that there's peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait or in the Himalayan plateau where India faces challenges with China. It's focused on, I think, innovative ways to engage in diplomacy within the region to deal with some of the challenges that the region faces, whether it's indigenous or environmental issues, by working with Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, to create new formulas of cooperation within the region. It's focused on trade. The Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is a good example, but Canada is also trying to sign an ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and we'll probably talk about this in a little bit. There was a considerable amount of hope that both India and Canada could come to an FTA by the end of 2023, and I do hope that's the direction we go next year as these two important countries, and I think they're friends, continue to try and build better relations based on what they have in common and not so much some of the challenges that we've faced in the past month or two.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagy. Now, there are so many difficult developments taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. The Chinese are reclaiming islands, and they are claiming a huge area of the South China Sea to be of Chinese sovereignty, and they are also flexing their muscle. Then Japan is, in a very big way, again improving its defense capabilities. US and China apparently have been having an economic cold war for a pretty long time. So a lot of developments are taking place. Then this side, Quad has now become a reality. For 10 years, it was in nation. Now it has come back to the main even discourse as well as the strategy in how to maintain Indo-Pacific stability. So how do you look at the major trends, the strategic trends taking place in the Indo-Pacific region from the Canadian perspective?
Well, I think there's a few areas that we can look at. One is technology, one is trade, one is sea lines of communication, and maybe lastly, I guess, competition for developing states and to have influence with developing states. So in terms of the technology front, I think AI and quantum computing, cybersecurity, hypersonics, the speed of change has, I think, exponentially increased, making it difficult to adjust to as a state. And Canada is interested in contributing to, I think, finding ways to regulate these areas to ensure that whether it's AI or quantum computing or cybersecurity is really based on rule of law, and that Canada is part of the broader process of being, I guess, the first movers or the states that create a set of rules that ensure that the values that we have and the institutions that we have and the political institutions that we have remain transparent and stable and rules-based. Second is trade. As you mentioned in the initial opening, this is where the middle-class consumers are going to emerge from. This is where the consumption zones are going to be emerge from. And Canada is very much interested in locking themselves into the major trade agreements and producing new trade agreements that again focus on Canadian comparative advantages, but again trying to deal with, I think, some of the major trends such as IPR protection, intellectual property rights protection, limiting the role of state-owned enterprises, improving environmental and labor regulations. So economics is really, really important. The third area that I wanted to mention was sea lines of communication and the challenges that I think all the countries in the region face. About $5.5 trillion US of trades goes through the Malacca Straits and the South China Sea, and this trade fuels the second and the third and the 10th largest economy. And we know that if there's a disruption in the sea lines of communication, that this will have regional and global ramifications for the global economy. So regulating sea lines of communication through rules, I think is really critical. Lastly, I mentioned the developing world, or sometimes called the global south. I think there's strong concerns that China uses initiatives such as the BRI to court and to shape the decisions of developing states and BRI members. And this impacts their decision-making in international organizations. Last year, we saw two, I think, important decisions by that were. One was the annexation and incorporation of parts of Ukraine into the Russian sphere. The countries voted against condemning this really demonstrating that force can be used to change the boundaries and borders, which is a big concern. And for Indians, of course, where you're based, you have a big concern with China doing something similar. But I think there's also concerns about the BRI members voting down human rights reports, such as the August 2022 Human Rights Report on the situation of the Uyghur people. So I think Canada, as well as Japan and other countries, are looking at ways to work with the developing states, the global south, to try and help them make more strategically autonomous decisions that are not shaped by outside pressure or incentives associated with some of the practices that can be found within the BRI.
I know it is very difficult, but China, the way China has been flexing its muscle, and there is a concern about how China is going to behave as far as the Taiwan issue is concerned, and how the US and China are now deeply involved in some kind of strategic competition. Do you think all these issues might delay the economic prosperity of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. Competition can benefit, I think, the developing states. So we have China, of course, spearheading the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. And then we have India and the United States, Japan and Australia, and other countries promoting the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific vision in one form or the other. And in many ways, they're competing with each other. And that competition allows developing states to get more from these two competing initiatives. So I think that the competition is not necessary if it serves the customer states. And if they position themselves well, they can get a good bargain from. Aside from that, what happens is these two projects compete with each other. They have to be better salespeople. They have to provide a better product. And again, I think this is good for the recipients of infrastructure connectivity aid or other forms of aid. But as you said, can the competition or can the strategic rivalry affect the Indo-Pacific development? I think it does, because it creates challenges in terms of economic integration. We see more balkanization of the global economy, which really increases the cost for the consumers and the producers, which really doesn't do anybody any good. So I do think that there are some drawbacks to competition, but there are also some positive sides to competition, and we need to try to insulate us from the drawbacks, but also look to the competition as a place where we can get more resources from the two competing sides. And here I think India and Southeast Asian countries and others really, if they play their cards right, I think they can get a lot of extra help for their own development by playing on the two competing sides of this US-China strategic rivalry.
India, the US, Japan, and Australia, you mentioned, they have become part of a quadrilateral security initiative. Yeah. And in fact, as articulated by all these four member nations, the goal of Quad is actually to deal with issues of emerging technology, then climate change, and even health security, etc., etc. However, Chinese government thinks that it is a new kind of Pacific NATO in the making, that it is a mechanism to contain and constrain China's growth. Now, but on the other side, of course, the entire goal is not to contain China, but to ensure that China should not disrupt the economic activities and peace and stability in the region, and should respect national sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries. So how does Canada look at Quad as an initiative?
So first, I think it's really important. There's a Chinese saying, calling a horse a deer. It doesn't matter how many times you call the Quad a containment organization. It's still not a containment organization. India has a very different view about the quadrilateral security dialogue. And I think India, along with Japan, have pulled the Quad towards really being a provider of global public goods. And you mentioned some of them, right? Infrastructure connectivity, technology cooperation, vaccine production. It's a problem-solving mechanism or a problem-solving multilateral to deal with some of the challenges in the region, but also the limitations of multilateralism. So how does Canada feel about the Quad? Frankly, I think that they feel left out, and they should feel left out, but they're left out because of, I think, a broader pattern of unpredictable or unreliable behavior within the region. But that being said, they're looking for opportunities to what I call plug in to the Quad, like Lego. So they plug in on different activities that suit their comparative advantages. So we've seen some examples of that where Canada's plugged into some of the maritime domain awareness activities in exercises around the Quad, the Guam. And I think that this is an area that they will continue to plug into. Depending where the Quad goes in terms of the technological research committees, I think Canada also has a place to plug in here. But it really will depend on what kinds of problems have emerged and how the Quad can be used as a center of organization to bring in the comparative advantages of not only Canada, but also South Korea, potentially New Zealand, potentially European powers. So think about it, the Quad as this problem-solving mechanism, provides global public goods, but can be flexible to bring in other partners on an ad hoc functional basis. And that's how I understand the Quad. And I think that makes sense because of the region's heterogeneity, but also the Quad's heterogeneity in terms of some of its priorities.
Thank you, Professor Nagy. My next question is, at the moment, two important members of Indo-Pacific region, Canada and India, are having diplomatic difficulties. I would describe it that way, diplomatic difficulties. Both are democracies, both believe in rule of law, and both believe in human rights. Both are concerned about terrorism as an issue and separatism as an issue. So at the moment, this diplomatic standoff that everybody knows what's going on between India and Canada, how quickly and how the two countries should actually resolve the issue through negotiations and dialogue, so that the common people who are getting affected, either getting a visa or doing normal trade relationship, their grievances can be addressed. So what would be your recommendation?
So this is a really important question, and I firmly believe that Canada and India have much more in common than not in common, and that I think the recent accusations by the Prime Minister of Canada was somewhat cornered by the Canadian media to make this accusation public, which created many optical problems for both countries, and the Indians, of course, had to respond in kind. But I think for Canada, the best way to move forward really is to I would recommend a year in India and Canada year, where they focus on perhaps cultural activities, Indian literacy, understanding more of the Indian challenges, opportunities, and development, and really creating much more literacy amongst the Canadian public about how much change has happened in India. This is a first step, and I think if Canada could take that first step, it may be an opportunity for perhaps India to do something similar, a year of Canada in India to reciprocate. And I think this is kind of activity can promote cultural exchange, language exchange, mutual understanding, and can create the optics that may move and create the space for some of the more difficult problems that exist between the two countries to move back behind closed doors, move back and let the diplomats settle the challenges, rather than social media, which, as we know, social media is sometimes a lot more exciting and stimulating and not so politically diplomatic as it could be. So I'm a real believer in that kind of exchange, and I think the ball really is in Canada's court at this particular stage. And I think a well thought out initiative such as a India in Canada year may be reciprocated to reset the relations and get that trade agreement back online, but also deal with some of the insecurities that I think citizens in both countries have.
Professor Nagy, you have an illustrious career as a researcher, as a teacher, as a professor. You write so extensively in the media, even about the current developments taking place. Very, very nice ideas. You float through your writings and all. Now, a large number of students and researchers will be watching this program. So I would like to request you to share some of your own personal experiences so that the kind of hurdles we face as a researcher can be avoided by the scholars when they get involved in doing research, particularly in the field of international relations. So some of your personal experiences for the benefit of the students and the scholars.
Well, I'm going to share an experience from a friend of mine, and the PhD experience is a lonely one. And I agreed with him because I think as you go towards getting a PhD, nobody really understands your ideas. You're always faced with explaining your ideas, and it's quite difficult. But understanding that the other PhD students or master students have a similar issue helps you put in perspective that this is part of the process of becoming a scholar and defining and learning how to communicate in a way that other scholars can understand. Second, I think one of the best things that has propelled me forward was attending conferences and being able to communicate with people. So actually 17 years ago, I attended my first international conference in Canada. I was at the Japanese Studies Association of Canada. And I was a young graduate student, and I gave a paper, and I received an award from the then Canadian ambassador to Japan. And just last week, I gave the keynote on Japan-China relations. So I think participating in these conferences gives you the network and the community and the support to help you grow and develop. Lastly, I think being selfless is really important, helping others, building that network, giving constructive feedback, and working as a team is so important in terms of producing good work, but also creating the kind of relationships that will help support you when things are difficult, but also when giving you the kind of atmosphere where you're learning from people all the time. So it's a couple things that I think have helped me, and I think everybody's formula is a little bit different. But again, working with people, going out and sharing your ideas, and understanding that you're not alone are key prerequisites to, I think, achieving some success in academia, scholarship, and public intellectualism in general.
That is very useful experience that you shared with us. And talking to you was actually a pleasure. So much of insightful remarks that you made. And I request Monish to give a formal vote of thanks to you from his side. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. It's been like a few minutes of conversation, but the kind of information and assessment that has been shared in these few minutes, I believe, not only for me and Professor Mahapatra sitting here, but when it is shared with a wider audience, I believe that it will be of extreme importance to a lot of scholars, young scholars, and even experienced ones who are working in the broader field of Indo-Pacific, and also particularly looking at how Canada features in that, and also the way you have answered the very sensitive issue of India-Canada diplomatic tension at this point of time. And I think it's what really taking forward. And it has been a very fruitful fourth episode of Samvaad. We are at the fourth episode, but I'm quite sure that we have generated quite a viewership in these 4 episodes. And thank you, Professor Nagy, as always. And we believe that there will be many more collaborations with you in person and also with the institutions that you are affiliated with. And to the wider audience, stay tuned for more such episodes on pertinent themes of the Indo-Pacific. And until the next time, it's a goodbye and stay well and stay connected. Thank you so much.